No one on that train gave Margaux Delacroix a second look, which was exactly how she had learned to travel. She was in seat 4A of Via Rail's business class, which she'd nearly called the agency to decline. The sponsorship letter from the CF Medical Alumni Fund had said the ticket was covered, and her administrator at Health Sciences North had looked at her with the patient expression of someone who'd had this particular argument before. "Margaux, get on the train." So she had. But she hadn't changed out of her scrubs, because there hadn't been time between the end of her shift and the cab to the station, and the hospital ID badge was still clipped to the lanyard around her neck, because she'd forgotten it was there until they were pulling out of Union Station, and it didn't seem worth the trouble to take it off. She looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a hospital orderly on her way somewhere she didn't quite fit. Lancer was pressed against her left leg, the way he always was. He was 10 years old, a Belgian Malinois with a graying muzzle and a notch out of his left ear from a fragment that had never been written up in any official record. His right hip gave him trouble on cold mornings, and the train car was cold, and he'd settled into the slightly deliberate posture of an old animal managing itself carefully. His harness was clean and fitted correctly, and on the front strap there was a small citation tag, military issue, worn smooth at the edges, with a unit number and a date stamped into the metal. She had the documentation in a folder in her bag. She always had the documentation. The business class ticket had felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Business class was for people who moved through the world with ease, who pressed the attendant call button as a reflex and expected their surroundings to reorganize accordingly. Margaux had spent the last 3 years learning to be invisible in hospital corridors, and invisible people did not sit in row 4. But Lancer was 10, and his hip was bad, and the coach cars were full, and she'd talked herself into it the way she'd talked herself into most things over the past few years, not by convincing herself it was fine, but by deciding the practical argument was sufficient. The couple boarded at the last call. She noticed them the way she noticed most things, without turning her head. The man was in his 60s, silver-haired, the kind of watch that cost as much as Margaux's car. He was with a woman 15 years younger, in a coat the color of expensive restraint, and they came down the aisle with the particular ease of people who'd never had to think about whether they belonged. The man stopped at row 4, looked at Lancer, looked at Margaux. Something settled in his expression that she recognized without difficulty, the flat certainty that something was not in its proper place. "There's a dog," he said, not to her, to the air the way certain men addressed situations they found beneath direct engagement. "He's a retired CF service dog," Margaux said. She kept her voice even. She'd learned to get ahead of it. "I have full documentation, health clearance, behavioral certification, transport authorization, everything." The woman's gaze moved across Margaux slowly, cataloging the scrubs, the lanyard, the worn jacket. She didn't say anything immediately, which was sometimes more deliberate than speaking. "Philip," she said. He was already reaching for the attendant call button. He did not look at Margaux's when he pressed it. She was an inconvenience being reported to management, and the press of the button said so more clearly than anything he could have articulated out loud. The attendant's name was Sylvain. He came down the aisle with the expression of someone who had already been told on some cellular level that this was going to be unpleasant. He looked at Lancer. He looked at Margaux. A small adjustment happened in his face, the suppressed version of something he wasn't permitted to say in a professional context. "Ma'am, could I see the documentation for the animal?" She handed him the folder. He reviewed it carefully, longer than necessary, in the way people took extra time with things they didn't want to act on. Then he excused himself to make a call toward the front of the car. When he came back, his voice was quiet. "Everything is in order. But given the concern raised by one passenger," Margaux said. "I understand that, and I apologize. We do have a seat available in premium coach with additional aisle space. The dog would actually have more room there." Philip Vandermeer said, "It's not a class issue, it's a hygiene concern. Some of us have genuine sensitivities." He had mentioned no sensitivities before that sentence. Margaux looked at him. He was waiting for her to push back, to demand, to make herself difficult. She could see it in the angle of his jaw. She had the thought, not for the first time in her life, that she could pull out the right page from the folder and say the right words and make the situation undeniable. She'd learned that people like this didn't actually want the facts. What they wanted was to not be wrong, and facts had nothing to do with that. She picked up her bag. "Come on," she said. Lancer rose from the floor in that slow, precise way of his, pressed against her left knee, and they walked. She did not look back at row 4. Premium coach was fine. The seat was wider than she'd expected, and Lancer settled on the floor with a long exhale that sounded like the decision to stop caring about something. Margaux sat with her arms folded and her jaw tight, and did not let herself feel the particular indignity of what had just happened, because she had felt it before and had learned the cost of carrying it in her body. Past Kingston, the train curved north, and the lake filled the window on the left side, flat and gray in the late afternoon light. She was thinking about the symposium schedule, about whether she'd remembered the second set of orthopedic insoles for her work boots, when Lancer shifted beside her in a way that made her look down immediately. He was on his feet when he should have been resting. His breathing had changed, faster, shallower, with a faint irregularity she'd learned to measure over the past 3 months. Not the low distress sound he made when something triggered the old responses, something physical, something in the chest. She was on the floor before she'd thought about it. Her hands moved along his sternum, and she felt the flutter she'd been tracking since his last appointment. The arrhythmia his vet had flagged as manageable, but requiring close monitoring. He hadn't had his midday medication. She'd been 40 minutes behind schedule leaving the hospital, and the medication was in her bag, and he'd seemed settled at Union Station, and she'd made a calculation error. She had it in her hand in under a minute. She sat on the floor of the coach car and ran through the dosing logic the way she'd run 100 calculations in worse circumstances: weight, last dose, time elapsed, contraindications. And the passenger across the aisle was watching her with the polite alarm of someone who didn't know whether to say anything. "Is he all right?" The voice came from 2 rows back, a woman. Margaux looked up. She was in CF service dress, no medals, but the insignia on her collar made Margaux's eyes stop and recalibrate. The woman was in her mid-50s, gray at the temples, with the posture of someone who'd held rank long enough that it had settled into the bones permanently. She was watching Lancer with an expression that wasn't simple concern. It was something older than that. Something that had been sitting in her face for a long time and had just found a reason to be visible. "Not sure yet," Margaux said. "Is there anything you need?" Not "can I help?" Not "is there anything I can do?" Is there anything you need? The specific phrasing of someone trained to assess under pressure. The distinction was small and exact, and Margaux noticed it the way she noticed most things. "Not right now, thank you." The officer didn't leave immediately. She was looking at Lancer's harness. More specifically, at the citation tag on the front strap and the date stamped into the metal. "That unit number," she said, low enough that it didn't carry. "2nd CMBG forward element, Afghanistan rotation." A pause. "Operation Highwater Ridge." Not a question. Margaux kept her hands on Lancer's ribcage. The medication was beginning to work. She could feel the first small easing under her palms, the arrhythmia settling toward something regular. "My name is Parks," the woman said. "Colonel Dominic Parks. I was the commanding officer for the Highwater Ridge operation." The train moved through the dark outside Brockville. Lancer's breathing steadied. Margaux kept her hand on his side and counted the beats. "I know," she said finally. Parks sat back into her seat. She didn't ask anything else, but she did not stop watching the tag for the rest of the journey. They arrived in Ottawa at 6:15. The platform was cold, and the light was the flat yellow of fluorescent tubes against a gray December afternoon. Margaux had Lancer leashed and her bag over one shoulder, and was thinking about the hotel shuttle when she heard footsteps behind her, deliberate, at the pace of someone who had decided something. Miss Delacroix. She turned. Parks was carrying a single bag and had the particular economy of movement of someone who'd long since stripped travel down to the minimum. "Your sponsorship letter was still in the seat pocket when you moved," Parks said. It has your name on it. Margaux absorbed that, all right. Walk with me. They walked. Lancer moved between them without being directed, threading the space at Margaux's left knee. The Ottawa station echoed around them, the smell of coffee and floor cleaner. Passengers dispersing in every direction. 6 years ago, Parks said, on the 14th of March, an unidentified medic appeared at the secondary extraction point for Operation Highwater Ridge. The official record describes her as unidentified civilian medical personnel, female, approximate age 28 to 32. She treated 2 CF soldiers with critical injuries and a military working dog for approximately 40 minutes under active contact before the medevac arrived. A pause. She was gone by the time the debrief team reached the site. Nobody got her name. Margaux said, "That's not what happened." No, it isn't. They stopped near a concrete pillar at the edge of the main concourse. Lancer sat on Margaux's left foot, which he did when she stopped moving, and he wanted her to know he was there. "Tell me what did happen," Parks said, not a command, an invitation offered to someone who'd been waiting 6 years to be asked. Margaux's unit had been running a parallel medical support mission in an adjacent sector. They'd taken contact in the dark, in difficult terrain, and she'd gotten separated during the withdrawal, moved east toward the nearest extraction corridor without the rest of her team. She'd found the secondary LZ because she'd heard a dog. A very specific kind of sound, low and continuous, the sound of an animal trained not to vocalize during contact and doing it anyway because something was wrong with its handler. Corporal Jan Villeneuve had been 24. He'd had 2 penetrating chest wounds and a broken femur, and he'd been lucid when she reached him, which had surprised her. He'd asked about the dog before he'd asked about his own injuries. "How long did you have him?" Parks asked. "About 50 minutes, until the medevac landed." Corporal Villeneuve didn't survive the surgery. No, she'd known. She'd known from the moment she'd seen the chest wounds. "I got the bleeding controlled. I kept his airway clear. The helicopter came with 8 minutes to spare." She looked at the ground, then back up. 8 minutes is workable. I've worked with less." Parks was quiet for a moment. "The classification order was filed 48 hours after the operation," she said then, "by an intelligence liaison officer named Captain Réal Bergeron, since retired. Your presence at the LZ was categorized as an unauthorized breach of a classified operational perimeter. Your account in the debrief was classified. Your name was not added to the official record." She held Margaux's gaze. "I didn't know about it until 14 months after the fact." "And when you found out?" "I opened a formal complaint with the CF Ombudsman. It was assessed and closed without action. I opened a second complaint through the CF National Investigation Service 2 years later." Parkes paused. "It's been moving slowly, but it has been moving." Margaux looked at her. "They passed me over for promotion twice in the year after Highwater Ridge. Then I got transferred to a supply logistics posting in Petawawa, which was not a good faith posting, and we both know it. I put in for reassignment 4 times. She stopped. "The math on what I'd get by fighting was very clear. I was 29, I was tired, I left the CF. You became a hospital orderly. I kept my nursing license, the rest of it." She didn't finish that sentence. It didn't need finishing. "I left because I needed to be done." Which was true, and also not the whole truth. Parks held her gaze for a moment, with the expression of someone who had done the accounting on a decision they couldn't revise. "Bergeron made this call," Margaux said, "because my being there was an inconvenience to the operational record." "Yes." "He's retired." "He is, but he's not unreachable." Parks reached into her jacket and produced a card, plain, a phone number, an office address. "The Ombudsman's office has been in contact with the Civilian Oversight Board for 3 weeks. When I saw you get on that train this evening, when I saw Lancer's tag, I made a call from the platform." She looked at Margaux steadily. "The kind that changes a timeline." Margaux took the card. They found out about Philip Vandermeer 2 days later from an investigator named Agent Fournier with the CF Professional Standards Division. Vandermeer had watched Parks's face when she'd first seen Lancer's harness. He'd watched the controlled recognition move through her expression, and he'd understood enough of it to be afraid. He'd made a call from the train, not to Bergeron directly, but through the contractor network they'd both moved in for the better part of a decade, a network that had included, at various points, the intelligence infrastructure surrounding Operation Highwater Ridge. Bergeron had assessed the formal complaints against him as manageable for 2 years. The call from Vandermeer was the first indication they'd become something else entirely. He'd moved too quickly and too visibly, and the Professional Standards Division had been watching long enough to see it. The review board convened 3 weeks later in the Perks building in Ottawa. Margaux drove herself, because she'd been offered a ride twice and had declined both times. She needed the drive to be what it was, 40 minutes of highway, where her hands had something to do and her mind could arrive at whatever shape it needed before she walked into a room. The hearing room was not a courtroom. It was a long conference table, 6 CF officers, the flat procedural focus of people who'd done this before and understood that precision was a form of respect for everyone present. Agent Fournier's division presented the timeline. The complaints Parks had filed over 6 years, the classification order and its deviation from standard CF protocol, the gap between the order and any substantive challenge, the reason for the gap. Margaux testified for 40 minutes. She said what had happened at the secondary LZ. She said it clinically and completely, the way it had to be said to be survivable. She described Corporal Villeneuve's injuries, the triage order, the specific interventions, the time to medevac. She described Lancer staying pressed against Villeneuve's left side until the medics physically moved him to load the stretcher. Toward the end, the board chair looked at her directly. In your own words, Ms. Delacroix, not in the language of the review record, what did you do at that extraction point? She thought about how to answer that. Not what to say, she knew what to say. She was thinking about how to say it truthfully, which was a different question. I kept 2 soldiers and a dog alive long enough to get them out, she said. I was in the wrong sector according to the perimeter map. I had the training they needed. I used it. She held the board chair's gaze without looking away. I didn't do it because someone gave me an order. I did it because they were there and I could. That's the whole account. The board recessed for 35 minutes. When they returned, the finding was read without preamble. The classification order, filed by Captain Rael Bergeron, had exceeded appropriate authority and had been applied in a manner inconsistent with established CF protocol. The official record for Operation Highwater Ridge would be amended to include the full account and identification of Corporal Margaux Delacroix, CF nursing officer, as the assisting medical officer at the secondary extraction point. The matter of Bergeron's conduct was referred to the appropriate civilian authorities for review of potential criminal misconduct. Vandermeer's contractor relationships were subject to separate examination by the Oversight Board. And separately, and here the board chair paused in a way that drew the room slightly tighter. The board was recommending that a commendation filed by Margaux's unit commanding officer 9 days after Operation Highwater Ridge, recommending her for the Star of Military Valor, be processed without further delay. The file had been sitting in the CF Honors and Awards Directorate for 6 years. It had never been processed because the person named in the commendation was listed as unidentified in the Highwater Ridge record, and no one had connected the 2 documents until Fournier's team had put them in the same room. Margaux sat at the table and looked at the front of the room and breathed. Parks, in the observer chairs, rested her hand briefly on the table near Margaux's, not touching, just near. The gesture of someone who understood that some moments had no adequate language. She called Lizzie Villeneuve the same evening, from the hotel room, with Lancer asleep at the foot of the bed. She'd found the number through the CF Family Liaison Office, and she'd sat with the phone for 11 minutes before dialing. Lise answered on the second ring, the way people answered who'd been hoping for a call without quite letting themselves believe it would come. "My name is Margaux Delacroix," she said. "I was with your son at the end." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of someone who had been carrying this particular question for 6 years and was now processing the fact that someone had finally picked up the other end of it. "He wasn't alone," Margaux said. "I want you to know that clearly. I was with him from the time I reached him until the helicopter lifted. He was conscious. He talked to me. Lise's voice, when it came, was very quiet. What did he say? Margaux thought about the extraction point, the dark, the cold, the particular smell of that kind of terrain. Jan Villeneuve lying on his back with his head tilted toward her, asking about the dog before he asked about himself. He asked about Lancer first, she said, whether the dog was okay. I told him he was. She paused. He said good, just like that was the most important thing to confirm before anything else. Lise made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite speaking. The particular sound of something held in too long, finally allowed to move. He was funny, Margaux said. He made a bad joke about the mud about 2 minutes after I reached him. He was scared, and he was pretending not to be, and he was very good at the pretending. She stopped. He was present all the way through. He wasn't in and out. He was there. They talked for another 20 minutes. Lise told her about Jan before the CF. How he'd been terrible at waking up for anything before 9 in the morning, how he'd taught himself to make proper tourtière because their grandmother's recipe had been lost and he'd refused to accept it as a permanent absence. How he'd brought home a stray cat once and named it General, and their father had pretended to be annoyed for 6 months before it quietly became his cat entirely. Margaux listened. This was not the part where her words were the point. The point was to be on the line. To be present in the space where Lise Villeneuve needed someone who had been there to finally sit with the parts of the story that had been given to her in redacted fragments. Before they hung up, Lise asked, "Do you still have him, Lancer?" "Yes." A pause. Jan would have wanted that. He used to say Lancer was the best decision the CF ever made. Her voice settled into something quieter. He'd want him with someone who understood what he'd done. Margaux looked at Lancer at the foot of the bed. He was already watching her. He did that when she was in a certain mode, one she couldn't always name herself, but that he apparently could, and had been able to from the first week. "He's doing well," she said. "He's good." That was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Lancer had been eating properly since she'd brought him home to Sudbury and sleeping through the night without the low intermittent sounds she'd heard in the first days, and that last week he'd spent 20 minutes investigating a patch of frozen ground behind her apartment building with the focused, unhurried attention of a dog who'd decided the world contained things worth examining again, as if he'd remembered something he'd stopped believing was available to him. She didn't tell Lise all of that. Some things were for keeping. The star of military velour arrived on a Thursday, which was her day off. She opened the box at the kitchen table, with Lancer watching from his bed in the corner. The orthopedic one from the farm supply store on Barry Down Road, because it was firm enough for his hip, and he'd stopped trying to sleep on the cold tile floor since she'd brought it home. The metal was smaller than she'd imagined. Precise and serious, and her name was engraved on the back, which was the only part she'd needed it to have. She held it for a while. Then she placed it in the wooden box she kept on the shelf above the dresser, not hiding it, just housing it the way you house things that matter without needing to look at them every day. The way you house things that were always true, whether or not the paper said so. She went to work on Monday. The shift at Health Sciences North was a double. The orthopedics ward was short-staffed, and there was a patient in room 14 who'd been asking for the same heated blanket since Saturday. Margaux found it in the linen closet on the third try and brought it without being asked a fourth time. At the end of the shift, she signed out, took the elevator to the ground floor, and walked out into the February cold. The Sudbury evening was dark and ordinary, in the way February evenings were. The kind of ordinary that was just life, continuing without fanfare, as it always had. Bergeron's review was moving through civilian channels. Parks had filed a final formal addendum to her 6 years of complaints, requesting the record reflect that her effort had predated any institutional response. Vandermeer's case was before the Oversight Board. Margaux had read all of it. Then she'd put the laptop away and gone to make tea, because some things didn't require more than acknowledgement, and acknowledgement didn't require an audience. The bus came. She got on. She wasn't the same person who had boarded a train from Toronto with a folder of documentation in her bag and a retired service dog pressed against her knee and a hospital ID badge she'd forgotten to take off. She wasn't different in any way she could point to from the outside. But something that had been held at arm's length for 6 years had been allowed, finally, to be close, not resolved, not erased, not made clean, just acknowledged in writing, in a room with people who had the authority to make it matter. The bus moved north through the Sudbury evening, and Margaux Delacroix sat with her hands in her lap and watched the streetlights pass, and thought about nothing in particular, which was something she had not been able to do for a very long time.